I think I had added one slide towards the beginning. Yeah, this one. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
You're getting started. Right. And right now I'm going to detail to the street.
Okay.
And are you?
Yeah, I'm here now. Innovations are we got it as PDF, so those won't.
Yeah, so this is my concern. There's a lot of the images had to reduce the file size to send to the
Our office, our regional office for East Jersey and Business Barbados is just spinning up a new work program.
if you go to slide 4,
Should be starting
for example, that should be red.
this fall or
There's a
something.
lot. Did you see that?
Yeah.
Image there.
Find out more about it.
Is it
We have
possible
two colleagues
I
that
have,
are.
I have,
Do you have any Macintosh with you?
That would be great. And we're working on
Mark's office.
trying to do more coordination and collaboration with GIZ and
Other
other zones. So it'd be great to get an
Yeah.
event.
I coordinate close with GIS and Grenada.
Okay, that's where we.
Program ICAP, forgot the acronym now, but it's like adaptation strategy.
And we're just starting to coordinate with
It's
them.
not, but I had less trouble with
They're
the,
supporting Grenada's national adaptation plan development. But Grenada asked us to come in and tell them about some of what we've done in Grenada, which is what I'll be
Okay. Oh, very interesting.
So it'd be great to get
I did it more people.
I was
there in February.
I was there, I think in February. I don't know when I'll be there. It's beautiful. I like it.
Yeah, I know, it's a good place. One of my favorites.
February was a very good time to go.
Yeah, definitely. But no, let's see if we can have just an informal chat with
That'd be great.
also, kids are very useful. Just to give perspective.
Let's just go to the top.
yes.
I found out a lot from Peter, the guy who's there. Very helpful. Okay, excellent.
All right, thanks. Yes, some of the images with the color is much more
Yeah.
effective. Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Well, I was like, 30 years ago, first US National Assessment started a program looking at climate impacts on water management. So that's why I started doing that. And we have done some development projects there. And I guess what I like about it is it ended up being a fellowship place for the garbage truck. Kind of fun. Fun is not exactly the right word.
Adventure.
But it was,
Part of it,
yeah. There's nothing. So
And you speak from here?
Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon and welcome. I know we have a few more people outside who are coming in, but we're going to get started. So welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, the director of our Global Sustainability and Resilience programs here at the center. And I was just chatting with a colleague, and he's saying, it's cold outside, and said, think hot, think islands. We're gonna make it a little bit warm in the auditorium today. So I know some of you are familiar with the Wilson Center. We serve as the living memorial to President Wilson, bringing together the worlds of analytical thinking, academia, research, policy, and programs. And most recently, we were ranked by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 U.S. think tank to look out for, and the #2 in terms of transdisciplinary research. And I'm very excited about that ranking because a lot of our transdisciplinary research covers work that we do on climate change and other sectors. And that's a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. And I wanted to start by framing our event, thinking about the title of the event today, Champions Islands, Champions of Resilience. And I'll invite you to just have a quick look at these couple slides. If you go to the second one. So all the development that has taken place has been wiped out. President of Vanuatu. So a little bit of the framing, thinking of islands as being very vulnerable to climate change impacts. But at the same time, we want to capture a lot of what is happening in islands to respond to climate change impacts. And I think today we have a very well-rounded discussion on what's happening in various island communities. We'll be looking at these issues in an island context from a legal perspective, from an overall development perspective. We'll hear from USAID. We'll hear from the World Bank in terms of some disaster planning work occurring in islands. And I'll talk a little bit about what's happening at the community level and how communities in different island settings are responding to climate change impacts and bringing in some of the social dimensions like population dynamics, which is an issue that we cover here at the Wilson Center. So I'm pleased that we have Maxine Burkett, who teaches climate change law and policy and taught law at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii, who's come all the way from an island to join us here today to share some of the work that she has been doing with our partners in island settings. So Maxine, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Aloha, everyone. I hope with that it feels a little bit warmer in here. It's good to be here despite the cold, and it's really excellent to be able to share with you some of the thoughts that I've been really re-engaging, especially right now, considering our the most recent world events with respect to Cyclone Pam and what's happened in the Pacific. It's an honor and a complete pleasure to be here to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to the Q&A afterwards to hear more from all of you about what your thoughts are. But what I'm doing today is thinking about how islanders are policy pioneers. In fact, a number of the policy proposals that have come down the line that are getting more attention these days were actually generated by islanders who recognized almost 2.5 decades ago that they have a particular vulnerability and are hoping to address it. And in fact, they're pioneers that need our support in actually being able to introduce, and elaborate on some of the policies that they've suggested at the international scale. So a little bit more about my background very quickly. I teach climate change law and policy as I was introduced as that professor, but I also look really at issues of climate justice. We're looking at vulnerability generally with respect to law and policy. I look a lot at where some of the novel areas of the law with respect to climate-induced migration, what we often hear as climate refugees. And I'm trying to think about new ways to allow the law to evolve, to be appropriately responsive to the new issues of climate change and the new kinds of disasters that climate change introduces. So I can't overstate the relevance of the framing that's been offered with respect to what's happened in Vanuatu. Island nations are seeing the development that they've experienced over the last few years being wiped out in a day in some cases. Some of that is much more slow going, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But what we're finding, and some of the language that's come out of Vanuatu after this most recent storm, is that there's a desire to not have to go around with a begging bowl. This is language that was being used. A desire to have more sophisticated responses to the 21st century type of disaster. There's a heightened call for a global compensation fund, better infrastructure, better disaster risk management processes and response systems. These are all component parts, again, of a 2 decade and a half old call for loss and damage mechanisms in the international negotiations, which might be a surprise, but I'm going to say a little bit more about that in the course of this talk. And the talk, I will say, is really based on an article that I've written that will be out in sort of hard copy in a couple of weeks, and it's rehabilitation, a proposal for climate compensation mechanisms for small island states. The outline here is sort of for the full 45-minute talk that I'm going to spare you today, but suffice it to say is that what I try to do in these kinds of talks is to give a little bit of background from the perspective of the law. What we understand about climate change is usually steeped in a very scientific conversation. I put a legal and policy lens on it to say, well, what's relevant about the science that makes us think differently? Then usually a brief history of the loss and damage system mechanism offered under the Framework Convention on Climate Change with some more details. But again, the proposal I'll save for the moment and just really talk about what is the instigating environment for that kind of proposal and what we mean by loss and damage. So first, the progression, the spectrum. When we've talked about policy with respect to climate change over the years, it was primarily mitigation. We were looking at reducing emissions at the international level. In some ways, adaptation was controversial. The use of the term suggested that we were sort of giving up on a more rigorous approach to reducing emissions. But in fact, adaptation became less of a dirty word, if you will, in the late 2000s, and we embraced that and understood that in spite of how rigorously or not we try to reduce emissions, that we will still have to deal with the climate that is the climate change that's sort of in the pipeline, right, that we already have committed to. We're now at a point, I think, where conversation is going beyond adaptation. And other mechanisms that we thought may not be necessary are in fact necessary. We're finding that we need to look at insurance, risk transfer mechanisms, and the possibility of compensation for those things that are completely lost. And this is the loss and damage discussion. When we say loss and damage, together the term has sort of a more technical definition, and it describes the actual and or potential manifestation of impacts associated with climate change in developing countries that negatively affect human and natural systems. Now, in sort of more informal language, loss is what it sounds like and damage is what it sounds like. Loss is impacts that for which restoration is not possible. And these are quite novel impacts. This would be the total destruction of coastal infrastructure due to sea level rise, or the total collapse of a fishery due to lower ocean pH or ocean acidification. And damage refers to the negative impacts that you can restore, right? At least restoration is possible. So this would be damage to coastal mangrove forests due to storm surge. It would also be those things that we generally understand as things that we could adapt to if we had instituted appropriate adaptation efforts and disaster risk management, or we could mitigate or avoid these impacts, right? Now, the loss and damage that is described and is being elaborated by small island states in particular sort of falls through the governance gaps right now. The climate regime is not addressing these specific issues, and there's been a push over the years to have greater attention to these three prongs. One is disaster risk management. The other is risk transfer through insurance and other novel mechanisms for fast disbursement of funds after a disaster. And then this piece on compensation, or I would say euphemistically, rehabilitation. Right? Okay, and why is there more attention on this? Because again, we're looking at costs that are quite large, and a significant percentage of the GDP of many of these countries that this cost would represent in any given event, and then of course over time. And this is true even if we were to stick to the most optimistic scenario of capping a temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. Interestingly, some of the events that we're looking at are the extreme events that are most strongly associated with climate change. This is important because attribution for lawyers in particular is incredibly important. Are you making the correct link? Is this really about climate change? What other contributions are increasing your vulnerability for which I'm not responsible or the international community does not need to manage under the umbrella of the climate negotiation? And we see the kinds of events that are going to impact and currently are impacting island nations that have a slow march, many of them. In other words, increasing heat, coastal flooding, especially due to sea level rise, these severe droughts that lead to desertification. These are slow onset events that we're seeing happening more and more, and they're very strongly linked, at least as the evidence offers us now, to climate change. So that's relevant. Another slide that I think is helpful, that we pulled this together for the Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessment, which is part of the National Climate Assessment. This is a schematic that offers a little bit of the impacts that we are seeing in island nations. And even though this is obviously a very nondescript island, it's really quite relevant across most island nations. And the kinds of impacts we're seeing are quite varied. So in addition to increased land surface temperatures, we're seeing increased ocean heat content, sea surface temperatures. All of these are pretty standard across the board, and we're seeing this happen in places like the Caribbean and the Pacific Islands that are known to have pre-existing vulnerabilities. We also know that places that have increases in sea level rise and coastal inundation are also places for which half the population resides within a mile of the shore. And almost without exception, the IPCC says international airports, roads, capital cities, and small islands of the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the Caribbean Sea are sited along the coast or on tiny coral islands. So I failed to mention this in my bio. I'm born in Kingston. So I'm from Jamaica. I now live in Oahu, yes.
Jamaicans.
There's Jamaicans, always Jamaicans in the audience. I now raise my children on Oahu. I joke that I spent most of my childhood and schooling on Long Island and Manhattan Island. I am an islander and varied islands. And islands have this kind of vulnerability. We're seeing that this is pretty static across the board. But again, of course, what differentiates, say, Manhattan and Honolulu from places like Jamaica is that the amount of resources that can be used to actually make you more resilient in the face of some of these storms is not available, right? And so even though small island nation states generally are responsible for less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, small islands are already expending scarce resources on strategies to adapt to growing climate threats and to also repair themselves after they have hit. So we have, so Kingston I've shown as an example, just by coincidence. We have seen that there are going to be major impacts. This I show as an example of heat extremes. My colleague at the University of Hawaii, Camilo Mora, has done a very groundbreaking article on climate departure. This was published in Nature. And what it was essentially demonstrating was that it will be a period of time at which the average temperature in this particular area will be higher, the low will be higher than the highest average prior to the certain date. So he's looking at the year of departure. When does that flip happen? When is the lowest average temperature higher than the highest average that we've experienced during normal years? And this is somewhere between 2047 and 2069. This is quite soon. So, and in fact, the sooner periods of time will actually be experienced first in tropical regions and islands as well. So Kingston and Honolulu were identified in this particular article that came out as of particular concern. I offer this image to say something about how I try to understand the loss element as well in a more sort of metaphorical way, if you will. This is an image. We had a pretty intense heat event in September in Honolulu, and this actual article was in the daily newspaper, and it was really meant to convey the absence of the sort of tragedy of the absence of air conditioning in our schools. And you see that the temperatures in the classrooms, in the lunchroom, were peaking at 101 degrees, 96 degrees, 94 degrees. I have 2 young children, and I was sort of imagining what the lost opportunity is here when you have children that are attempting to learn under these circumstances. In Honolulu, it requires an adaptive response of getting better airflow and air conditioning, but in other places, this might be more difficult, and it's something to consider. back to the Pacific, at least the South Pacific. We are in the North Central Pacific in Hawaii, but we are seeing some of the other events that I'd shown as far as extreme weather events. And again, we're seeing abnormally wet conditions in Guam. We have long-term drought impacts in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Again, there's sea level rise that's going to be relevant to all of these places as well. And in this unfortunate sort of collision of climatic sort of progression in the Western Pacific, we're seeing more sea level rise than we're seeing in other places. This is due to some more complex dynamics, but this is overlaid on the sea level rise that we're experiencing as a result of climate change. So when you hear about these events in the South Pacific, in Vanuatu, the movement of peoples in Papua New Guinea, this is the science, some of the science behind it. So sea level rise is chief among the impacts to small islands, and it makes events like Cyclone Pam that much more destructive when they do hit in these areas. Now, with that backdrop, the question is how do we handle these issues? So again, mitigation has been primarily the job of developed countries, and I think for everyone now as we move forward. But for developing countries, a lot of the conversation is about how best to adapt, how to find the resources and to do it most efficiently. But a fascinating study was done in 9 locations to determine whether or not adaptation is actually working. And Micronesia was one of the places in which they'd studied coastal erosion in attempts to make your community more resilient. They'd asked communities how many of them had adopted adaptation measures. More than half had. They also asked, since you've adopted these adaptation measures, were they effective? And 92% said they still experienced adverse effects despite having introduced some sort of adaptation measure. This seemed to be significant and underscore concerns that were actually introduced years before by Vanuatu, in fact, in the early 90s, but then championed by the Alliance of Small Island States, which is this mechanism for loss and damage. So the Alliance of Small Island States is actually a negotiating bloc, a coalition of small island and low-lying coastal countries that they share the same development challenges as well as the same concerns about the environment and in particular climate change. It's within the UN system. It represents almost 60 million individuals, citizens, 44 states, and states that are across the globe. So the Pacific, the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, the Mediterranean, Caribbean, and South China Seas. These are low-lying coastal states that share similar sustainable economic development challenges and again, concerns about climate. They are very diverse in terms of income, although most are middle and low income. Some are among the least developed countries in the world, and we have outliers like Singapore, but again, many of the impacts that they're experiencing are quite shared. The Pacific Islands in particular, and especially Vanuatu, they're situated in one of the most natural disaster-prone regions, highly susceptible to floods, droughts, tropical cyclones, and other disasters that compromise their ability to live without some kind of external shock to their economy and well-being. So the Alliance of Small Island States has been trying to think very expansively about how we respond. Again, moving beyond simply mitigation and adaptation as the sole policy responses. And this graph shows some of the ways you could think about the loss and damage mechanism that they're introducing, because they're recognizing that there, again, is a spectrum at which you can perhaps introduce risk management measures, so everything from soil techniques to help with agriculture during stress times, building codes and enforcement, watershed management. That's the disaster risk reduction pieces. Then there's risk transfer, again, once there is an event. Once a storm has come, how do you get back on your feet rapidly? That's what we use insurance for, so we can have rapid disbursement of funds during those periods. But then there's this other piece that's being sort of called residual risk. It's sort of a catch-all. I sometimes jokingly quote Donald Rumsfeld to say these are the known unknowns, right? What happens on beyond this period of time? And in fact, we see that that's where a lot of the controversy is occurring right now. Generally speaking, it's difficult to move these policy pieces because of inertia in a number of spaces, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is the most controversial because it includes notions of liability, responsibility, compensation, again, euphemistically, rehabilitation. And what we're dealing with in that area usually is the unavoidable and uninsurable risk. These are the things that are the slow onset events. This is desertification. You're in a part of the world where you are unable to grow food any longer. This piece of land is no longer viable. Thanks. This is also true, again, of sea level rise. This is ocean acidification, again, which I should note that is not climate change, but is sort of the evil twin. And then non-economic losses. These are impacts to your culture, your tradition. This also includes, but I set apart, migration and displacement, because migration and displacement are such massive issues that we're beginning to think more about. So what we're dealing with in the sort of extreme end of loss and damage is this piece. And again, we're hearing more of it, and certainly events like Cyclone Pam have reignited conversation about it in the general public discourse, but this has been a long-standing effort. Again, we see as a policy progression, we were talking primarily about mitigation, then adaptation, now enhanced adaptation. This notion of loss and damage being a key sort of frontier for us at the international negotiation level is quite clear. And then loss and damage has been since the 90s, something of concern, again, for AOSIS and similarly situated countries. And in fact, loss and damage has had some key dates that date back to 1991 through all of the COP meetings. And again, if anyone would like to see my slides, I'm happy to share them, but this just basically goes through a timeline that shows you just the sort of the long tail of the loss and damage conversation in the international negotiations. And what happened, it sort of came to fruition in Poland, in Warsaw, 2 years ago, I guess a year and a half ago. And what we saw was an advance in the conversation, in that there was an acknowledgement that loss and damage was real and that it perhaps needed some response. And the decision itself, in the second sort of fuller paragraph, acknowledges that loss and damage associated with adverse effects of climate change includes, and in some cases involves more than that which can be reduced by adaptation. This was a victory of sorts in terms of having this acknowledged in this particular document, there being a mechanism that was going to be introduced. There were detractors, though, that felt that this was as a result of a lot of compromise, and importantly, did not have action points to it, was really more an effort to continue to study, and studies would be, the results of the study would be released in 2016, which is after this year's very important COP meeting in Paris this December. So there are a number of concerns about what's happening post-Warsaw. Right now, the mechanism's executive committee, how it should operate, what to expect out of the work plan, the exact details of it, whether or not it'll be action-oriented, these are all being finalized right now. So, again, Cyclone Pam becomes this interesting instigating point for reigniting the conversation. There is actually a draft document for Paris that includes 3 possible mentions of loss and damage. The first elaborates much more of how it would be introduced and financed. The second is basically a statement to refer back to prior decision-making on it. And the third is a line that says, no mention, or something to that effect, right? But I think that third option is becoming less and less possible as we see countries that themselves have stories of resilience at the base and in communities that need the international support to continue to do those things. Quickly, a couple of hurdles that are experienced in the loss and damage conversation, just to make it clear. I've alluded to some of them. There are liability concerns by primarily developed countries or wealthier countries, global north countries, that are concerned that if there is an acknowledgement of a need for a loss and damage mechanism, if there is language like compensation, that means that there is a payout that needs to happen, and that's a sort of non-starter in terms of negotiation. I call the second the sort of strange South-South bedfellows phenomenon, which is that obviously the global South, developing countries are quite diverse, and who needs or has the more sort of compelling argument for loss and damage are those that are the low and middle income countries that really do need the support in these areas. There's also funding and donor fatigue issues. So obviously we know that we have several different numbers. One number is how much we actually need to invest in order to reduce emissions to keep ourselves under 2 degrees. This is anywhere between $500 billion to $1 trillion per year by some estimates. We have how much is actually allocated for adaptation, for which we need more money. That's in the billions range. All of this is far greater and dwarfs by magnitudes of orders of magnitude the amount of actual funding that's been pledged, the amount of funding that has been promised, by 2020, and the anticipation is that this will leverage other funds, but again, the large pie is only a fraction of what we need to address mitigation, adaptation, and then of course, not really even including the needs for loss and damage and migration. So there's some issues there. But it's important here to understand this is just a graphic that describes the differences in the pledge, promise, and actual need. What we see, though, is that these events might continue to happen, and so I would encourage all of us to think about how we can continue to support these communities, and thinking as I wrap up about how we can identify and understand resilience as well. Obviously, what happened in Vanuatu, this is a long-term struggle. This has initiated a lot of development needs moving forward, but there are a lot of stories of resilience that are, in addition to the policy pioneering that I've discussed, that are also quite heartening. There's a sort of widely embodied spirit in which communities in Vanuatu are being interviewed and are discussing what the impacts of these storms are. And probably one of the best stories I've heard, and it's just one story, but was about this man who had lost his home, and roofing material from another building just landed on his entire house. And he was like, my house is gone, but look at all this new material. And there was a sense of, let's get on with this, let's rebuild this. And I think, again, this is a widely embodied spirit, certainly within the region. And we see places like the Carteret Islands, the Solomon Islands. We're seeing communities that have to move, and are seeing atoll nations with communities that are being carved up by sea level rise, being quite resilient in their storytelling, in their ability to use community networks and creativity and ambitions about economic development in different ways to their advantage. And I close with this picture of Ursula Rakova because she is one of my heroes. She is heading the efforts by the people of the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea to relocate her community of some 2,000 people. And what she has done with the request of the Council of Elders is to lead the effort to have a permanent resettlement in their neighboring mainland area. It's an attempt to be self-reliant. It is thoughtful, it is careful, and it is caring. And I think we have an opportunity here to continue to support this kind of work because, again, there's a widely embodied spirit that I certainly have learned and gained much from. So thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Wow, thank you, Maxine. You sure packed a lot in there. That was fantastic. I really liked your framing of policy pioneers and need for support, and really, I very much appreciate your tracing this adaptation as a dirty word. I mean, I think sometimes we forget that now, how far we have come, but really situating loss and damage in an island context and talking about ways that it has fallen through governance and governance mechanisms, reminding us again of particular island ecosystem vulnerabilities, and the reminder that a Manhattan is not a Honolulu, is not a Jamaica. That there are these differences and differential vulnerabilities and capacities across the islands, and thinking about AOSIS as a negotiating bloc, and how do the islands position themselves in that context, sort of recognizing risk management, risk transfer, and residual risk, and what are we doing with regard to that residual risk as a community. I like your South to South Bed Fellows. We know that is a very important concern, but your overall framing of this in a climate justice frame, and really getting to the brass tacks of the financing and what it means for pledge promises and actual needs. So thank you. That was great. What are your hopes for Paris, but I think more importantly for beyond, in terms of islands and loss and damage? Many of us who heard the compelling stories coming out of the Philippine delegation after Haiyan hit, that was such a defining moment in the last negotiations. Is AOSIS really positioning itself for post-Paris? And if that is the strategy, what does it mean for us who are tracking these issues going into Paris? What should we be looking for? What's important for us from your perspective?
Sure, yeah, and there are a number of things that might happen in Paris that that will be related. But in terms of the specifics of this, I think the first and foremost priority is to make sure that this language is in the agreement, whatever it is that the legal agreement is that comes out of this, and it needs to be in there in a way that's elaborated with key language that addresses the financing issues as well as sort of the action orientation of whatever mechanism comes out of it, so that it's not just a sort of study mill. We have enough information, I think, about what the impacts are, but we need to sort of get to the nitty-gritty in terms of getting the action points out. So that would be, I think, one of the most important things. I think this is sort of more pie in the sky, but reintroducing the need for 1.5 degrees as an increased cap. This was really a big part of the AOSIS platform in the 2009 COP at Copenhagen, and it was sort of lost in the accord that came out of that, but it was meant to be revisited in 2015. And it's been, at this point, it doesn't seem like it's part of the conversation, because we likely will blow past the 2 degrees cap, but I think having a clear backstop is really still quite important. AOSIS has capacity issues because of the amount of sort of delegates it can bring to these negotiations and the resources generally. So supporting institutions will be key to assist in their efforts to have more sort of novel and ambitious policy that will aid islanders first, but of course will aid us all over time, because these are policies that we need for all of our communities, including our own coastal communities.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. So now we're going to move to John Furlow, who is currently on detail at the State Department, where he's helping to establish a national adaptation planning global network. John, in his work at USAID, leads the adaptation work on climate change. So John is going to share his perspective on some of the work that USAID has been doing in a variety of islands. John? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hey, good morning. Thanks everyone and thanks Roger Mark for having me on this panel. This is very interesting. I'm going to talk mostly about Jamaica, but sort of lessons we learned out of an attempt to introduce...
I thought we were going to get another yay in the audience, but they were just happy with
Jamaica?
the first Jamaica.
Not even from Maxine. Huh? So some things that got us thinking through some work we did in Madagascar, and then a several-year concerted effort to help Jamaica develop a national climate policy, and then a sector focus that we've done some work in the Philippines. So going back to when I started at AID, we and this is a bit more of along the lines of the history that Maxine put forward. In the international world, I think when adaptation was making its way into international development, there was an urge to treat it as something different from development. I think partly to be able to tell the story of why do you need adaptation funding if you're working with agriculture and you're working with tourism, whatever. And I think we took it a bit too far. I was part of that. I helped produce this document. And back in 2007, when we put AID's first guide on how to think about adaptation in development, the agency had a very small adaptation budget. And so we were focused on projects that were going to happen anyway, and what could we do to kind of climate-proof them. And so we focused on specific projects, and we focused on specific climate vulnerabilities. We didn't take a system-wide view. And this is basically the steps. You would screen for sensitivity, climate sensitivity. You'd think about options. You'd analyze the effectiveness of the options. You'd pick an option, implement it, and see how it worked. But again, you're within a specific project. And then I had a chance to go and do some work in Madagascar. And around the time that I got to Madagascar put out its Madagascar Action Plan, which was I guess a 5-year development strategy. This was before the coup. And we were looking at protected area. AID came in to add on to a MacArthur-funded project that the World Wildlife Federation and Conservation International were doing, looking at the impacts of climate change later in the century on protected areas, terrestrial and marine protected areas. And AID, my group kind of said, well, the missing trees, the damage that's already been done is coming not from climate change, but from people. So what was motivating the people to go in and to cut down the trees? And is there a climate stress on people that's going to accelerate the damage to the remaining trees, remaining protected areas, remaining forests, far sooner than the end of the century? And so we started looking at the Madagascar Action Plan, and the ambitions in there just kind of didn't add up. So they wanted to, among other things, increase road coverage by tenfold, increase the area of protected areas, increase tourist visits by 50,000, increase rice production, double it. And then we started, as part of the workshop, we started talking about where these things would happen. And it's hard to see because of the color, but basically the red circles are areas that had been identified as good places to protect, to preserve biodiversity across the rest of this century. And all those other circles are different economic activities: cash crops, rice, livestock. Remember, they wanted to double rice production, and they wanted to increase other activities and increase roads. And everywhere you see a concentric circle, you see a competition for space. So it became clear that they weren't, the map, the Madagascar Action Plan, was planned well by people who know their sector, but they weren't talking to each other. And so when they were thinking about the map, they were thinking that everything was available to their needs and not thinking about what the person planning the next chapter might be thinking about. This got me thinking about how do you get around that? How do you think long-term about where a country wants to be in 20, 30, 50 years, and what would it take to get there? And let's put the development ambitions in the center of the process, and then think about adaptation efforts to protect the investments in development and mitigation opportunities to make it more efficient, cleaner, and probably more cost-effective. And we started looking around for countries that wanted to do this, and we had a very hard time finding countries that could think out that far. That's multiple election cycles. And even if you can put together a plan, the plan itself may not last that long. So we kind of shortened our focus as AID redeveloped our approach to adaptation. We wanted to take a more economy-wide approach. We wanted to think about the interconnectedness of an economy. And so we put the emphasis not on the climate stress, but on the development goals. And I think where we add value and bring a difference to the typical adaptation approach is that we start with this scoping phase and we have a conversation with stakeholders in the country about what are your development goals. If not over 50 years, how about over 5 years, over 10 years? What really drives the economy? What drives social development? What's important to the identity and the development of a given country? Then we'll talk about how do climate and non-climate stresses play into this to undermine what you want to accomplish. And then what are the needs and opportunities? What can you do to alleviate these stresses? Then you get into a more typical vulnerability assessment process, design a project, implement, and evaluate. So these first two are really where we're kind of doing a diagnosis. This is pretty much the same thing. I think there's one copy of this out front, and it's online. And if you'd like to look at it, the easiest way to find it is to Google it. It is on the AID webpage, but sometimes it's not all that easy to find things on our webpage. I think if you go to aid.gov/climate, it does come up on the top page, but Googling always works, or searching with whatever search engine you prefer. So again, we start with development processes. We engage multiple players from across government and outside of government. We really try to do this process in a workshop environment. And our role is to facilitate a conversation, not to drive it or to provide the answers. We would like to bring in multiple donors as well, so that AID doesn't walk away with our own plan and then DFID or the bank or GIZ come in 3 weeks later and make them do it again, because there is Maxine had a slide about donor fatigue. There's also developing country fatigue with planning. And then we've tried it at different political and sector scales. This is basically the process in a nutshell, get a consensus, and if you can get those development objectives out of a national plan, then you know you've got buy-in, because it was produced by the country itself. Talk about what it takes to achieve the objectives, what are the risks, what are some solutions. So we started shopping around for a place to test this, and we had done it in the Eastern Caribbean and Barbados, and I distinguish those two. It's an aid organizational distinction. It's not a geographic distinction, but so in the Eastern Caribbean. And then we had a chance to do some work in Jamaica, and the Prime Minister of Jamaica asked the donor community to help them develop a new national policy for climate and ask aid to take the lead in coordination with the rest of the development community. Jamaica, a few years ago, put out this Vision 2030. I believe this document, this planning, this vision, this strategy has survived either 2 or 3 elections. So and changes of parties. So it's pretty solid, and it's driving what the government is doing. Just zeroing in on the things that look like economic activities fall under one of the objectives of the plan, of the vision. And then risk reduction and adaptation are down here. And so when you start talking to people in the government about, well, who's going to make sure that agriculture is resilient to climate change and hazards? Well, it's different. This is climate is now in the Ministry of Water, Land, Environment, and Climate. Disaster risk reduction is in the ODPM, the Office of Disaster Planning and Emergency Management. Agriculture has its own ministry. So you've got 3 different groups with different strengths, different amounts of clout in the government scattered around Kingston, and nobody knows who's on top. So we took this thing apart. We brought together about 100 different stakeholders from across the government and the donor community and NGOs and the private sector. Put them in a room in the hotel that you could see from Maxine's picture. It was the Wyndham at the time. I think now it's burned. But reopening, I've heard. And worked in small groups. It looked like this. We had 6 or 8 people at mixed sectoral tables working through each of those things that were in the red circle and saying, okay, if agriculture is important, what are the key inputs for agriculture? You need labor, you need land, you need water, you need seeds, you need fertilizer, you need functioning markets, et cetera. Did the same with tourism and manufacturing and water provision and electricity and transport. We worked in mixed groups and gave them stickies, and on the stickies they began identifying the key inputs, and then they began identifying the stresses and constraints, climate and non-climate. And this is what it looked like when we typed it up. So agriculture, key inputs are energy, water, crops, livestock, and fisheries, the food production itself, access to credit, and a legal and regulatory framework. And this was done very quickly. This is not comprehensive, but this was just to get people thinking, so that when we started talking about stresses and solutions to those stresses, then we could ask who in the government is responsible for helping with that solution. If you wanted to pull together a multidisciplinary team to deal with climate and agriculture, you wouldn't just want the ag ministry, because that's what they've had, and they know they have problems. So you start to see this Ministry of Water, Land, Environment, and Climate Change is the Water Authority, it's the Forestry Department, and very importantly, it's the Meteorological Service. And so we began working with them and trying to build their capacity to provide a useful forecast for farmers. One of the things that we wanted, I'll come back to that forecast. One of the things we wanted to do, and that I think the adaptation community has been saying they want to do, is get climate to be no longer treated as an environment issue, but as an economic issue, a development issue. And we say, we want to get it out of the environment ministry and into the planning ministry. This is a paraphrase of a quote. The finance minister walked up to me at the end and said, when you asked me to come to this workshop, I thought, why not the environment ministry? Why do I have to go to this? And then at the end, he said, now I want to know why nobody was talking to me about this for a long time, because he got it. I talked to a colleague last week, or week before last. He continues to push. The finance ministry is now pushing the climate policy. Some of the changes, so Jamaica is now writing its policy. It's not just an environment document. It's got a lot of the information that, similar to what was in Maxine's thing about potential damages and so forth. But it also, rather than the environment ministry owning the policy, it's a framework that pushes responsibility out to the sectoral ministries. So they're going to produce about 12 sector policies over the next year or two, owned by a climate change focal point in each of the ministries responsible for those. They will be, the policies will be developed by working groups from across the government, not just, transport working in transport. So it's out of environment into all the ministries. They're addressing adaptation and mitigation simultaneously. They're looking at multidisciplinary approaches like the one we took in the workshop. I'll skip over this, but they have identified 26 focal points across the government in 26 ministries and agencies. The policies that are underway, AID is working on forestry and ag with the government. We're supporting it, I should say. The 5Cs in the EU is supporting fisheries, and then you can see the rest that are coming over the next year or so. This is who all's involved. So it's gone from one person owning it to all of these groups working. Okay. So now I'm going to shift gears rather abruptly to a different part of the world. Well, let me just say that, so AID started looking for, given that the policy has been slow getting approved, we wanted to continue to provide some support. And we had that discussion about the Met Service. And the Met Service is weak in Jamaica. They're very capable people there, but there's not enough people, there's not enough computers, et cetera. So we held another smaller workshop and brought together all of the client agencies from across the government, people who depend on Met Service information. A little bit tense at first. They didn't feel that over time they'd been getting the best service from the Met Service. But by the end of the one-day workshop, we said, okay, who would like to work with the Met Service and AID and our colleagues at Columbia University? We want to demonstrate that the Met Service can produce one product for one client that's useful. And if it works, then we'll try to do another one. And we'll just build their capacity and build their usefulness. The Ag Extension Service raised two hands. Everybody wanted to work, but Ag Extension said two, and they said drought. So again, back to Maxine's slides. Drought is sort of this slow onset, insidious problem. You don't realize you're facing a drought until you're in the middle of it. But we've developed, colleagues, the Met Service, the Ag Extension Service, and then colleagues at Columbia University have developed a seasonal drought forecast that looks out 3 months. It's tied to a drought index. It looks at current conditions so that farmers now have a sense of what to expect over the next season and how bad a rainfall deficit will be if it's following a dry previous 3 months versus a wet previous 3 months. They had a drought in the first year that we put it out. The forecast was good. And it looks like, from what I heard from the Met Service last week, ag GDP dropped by about 30% last year due to losses from the drought. They think it would have been worse, but some farmers were able to either not plant or switch crops. And we're going to try to go back and investigate exactly what happened and what the losses might have been had there not been this forecast. So a sectoral application of that framework. We went into a team from my team, not me, but some of my colleagues went in and worked with the water department in Iloilo City. Iloilo was having trouble with provision of water. They were having trouble with, they thought that it was climate related. They were considering building a new storage reservoir to capture more water and hold it. But when we went through and talked to them about those, the non-climate stresses, we found that there were a lot of non-climate stresses. There's pollution. A colleague has a photograph of basically an open pit sewer that's a block or so from the water source. So they have contamination problems. They have lots of non-revenue water. They don't have a good billing system. Lots of people are just taking the water sort of unofficially. They do have floods and droughts. Okay. They have rapidly growing demand. And they're not well connected to the national government. So they know the utility has ideas of what they would like to do, but they don't know how to tap into national government funds to enable them to do this. So before they began, one of the outcomes of our working with them was that before they began building a new storage system, which wouldn't help them deal with the pollution or the non-revenue water or the change in demand, they're trying to tighten up the governance system on the water utility to fix some of the distribution losses in the system, to improve the billing system, and deal with some of the pollution problems. If that's not enough, then they can come back later and look at supply issues. So again, well, these are some additional resources. Like I said, there's a few things out front. And I'm happy to take questions. But I guess my main point is that when we think about adaptation, we're trying to push people to think about the development outcomes that they're really after, and where climate and non-climate problems are having a role, so that you address the right problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So once again, I appreciated you started with this question about when can we take adaptation too far, and how adaptation is different from development. I like your point about not having a system-wide view, and then talking about how do we bring people in. What are the climate stresses on people, and how does that fit in to a larger climate resilient growth? You talked about a number of challenges. You talked about having to deal with multiple election cycles, getting it out of just the Ministry of Environment and into planning and sort of mainstreaming. You talked about the capacity of the Met Services. You talked in Iloilo about their not being able to access sort of the national government systems, and sort of learning from that. So in the face of all these challenges, where are you seeing the greatest opportunities for sustainability? How do you keep the momentum going? This is good work, real progress. Maybe the grant period is up for USAID on this work. So I don't know. But how do you keep this going? What are your thoughts from a development practitioner perspective? USAID is very important in this space. How do we get to the questions of sustainability?
I think the reason that I'm at State right now for another month or so is the U.S. and Germany and the Philippines and Jamaica and Togo, South Africa, Brazil, and Malawi launched a national adaptation planning global network that was aimed at bringing bilateral donors more into the national adaptation planning arena, and encouraging better coordination, and providing a forum for countries that are working on their NAPs to learn from one another, so they don't all feel like they have to start from scratch. And so to Roger Mark's point, I think that individual development agencies' budgets come and go, our foci come and go. So I think that to make something sustainable in country, helping build that understanding that the issues that we're dealing with are not sort of esoteric, they're not something that's going to happen off in the future, and they're not just an environment issue. They are an economic issue, and there are impacts being felt now, and they are undermining development and economic growth. And then by encouraging better collaboration on the donor side, if one of us has a shift in focus, the others are there to kind of fill the gaps. Better coordination can also keep us from doing the same things and leaving big gaps elsewhere. And by putting the climate work in the context of the development needs, it gives opportunities. A lot of the work that we've done in Jamaica has been funded out of an ag program. It's a mix of climate and ag money, but the recognition that the climate and the agricultural ambitions are intricately linked enables our field mission to say, okay, well, it doesn't really, there's an outcome that we want. Climate is undermining the outcome, so we can pay for this with either type of funding, and it's appropriate to do so. So I think just explaining those connections and building the connections within the government, among the development agencies and the host country government, and among the development agencies, kind of creates redundancies and ties that may help sustain some efforts.
Great, thank you. So Gaetano Vivo is a disaster risk management specialist in the World Bank Global Practice for Social, Urban, Rural, and Resilience. And Gaetano and I are both members of a Global Resilience Academy that's convened by the UN University and the Munich Re Foundation. And the Munich Re Foundation is providing some of those climate risk reinsurance schemes that Maxine was talking about earlier. So Gaetano and I have been looking at some of these examples, and today he's going to talk a little bit about his work in the Caribbean and other islands looking at disaster risk management.
Thank you very much, Roger Mark, for the invitation. Good afternoon to everybody. So I'm a disaster risk management specialist at World Bank, as Roger Mark said, and I've been working in Haiti. I've been based in Haiti for almost 4 years, and I've been working recently also on the Eastern Caribbean island, particularly on Grenada and Dominica. Before delving into the more technical aspects of hydrometeorological services, I wanted just to recall a little bit the big challenge that we have here, that these countries have in terms of development. All right. So we use often this metaphor of the leaking bucket to really highlight the loss of growth, the missing growth lost to hydrometeorological and climate hazards. So the blue section of those columns is the missing growth, and that's the average annual growth rate, and you see in blue the missing growth for the Caribbean islands. Similarly, the big challenge that small islands, developing states, compared to developing countries in general, have vis-a-vis hydrometeorological and climate hazards. So it's more than 2/3 of the countries with the highest average annual disaster losses are small island states, just to look a little bit at the bigger picture. And here you see the 5 building blocks of what we in the World Bank have as our resilience strategy, which is similar or stems from the Hyogo Framework for Action. And to each of these 5 areas, data, and in particular hydrometeorological and climate data, are critical. I just wanted to give some a little more concrete examples of why we emphasize this data so much. This is type of work that we are doing in the Eastern Caribbean island in Grenada. I was recently there, and we are helping the government to prepare a new project that has a strong component on data management and to improve planning, to inform development. So here you have several type of geospatial information. So starting from a digital elevation model that gives you the topographic analysis of the territory, the marking of the watersheds, the soil map, land cover, and then the hydrometeorological layer, the rain in this case. All of this is needed to model flood and drought. And it seems simple. In a way, it is simple, and also increasingly cheaper, because there's technology has improved hugely over the past years. There's open data, open source softwares. But what this really requires is a paradigm shift in the ministries we are working with, in the way they plan, in their working cultures. And this is really the biggest challenge that we are having. So these are other examples. This is in Sao Tome, where relocation of people from high-risk area is happening while being informed by science, by data on flood-prone areas. In Haiti, the country that I know quite well, having spent some time there, so this is a innovative type of work that we and the Inter-American Development Bank have been doing and are still doing. Mapping the hazard, that's the first step. That is one of the watersheds in the north of Port-au-Prince. It's actually in the metropolitan area of Port-au-Prince. For those of you who know the Haiti is Croix des Bouquets. And in different colors, you see the different degree of flood-prone areas of presence of the hazards. Then in the second picture is the vulnerability. So we map the assets, the population, the buildings, the resources that are at stake. And then we use this information to inform action, so to inform plans. And that is perhaps the most critical part, because it requires work understanding, first of all, the way people in institutions think, planners, emergency responders, but also the community. And we build hugely on community, to test these ideas and to see what makes sense. That is critical, and actually that has determined the failure of many projects over the past years. So this is again another example. It's not very clear, but it's just how contingency plans. You see in green the schools, the shelters. All of these are overlaid over the hazard map. So it's just examples of what we can do. Another application, and this was one of the 5 pillars, is risk transfer. The speakers before me have emphasized that it's a critical aspect especially for the high probability, high impact disasters, to transfer part of this risk. And data, again, are critical to this, are critical to determine the parameters that, the trigger the payout of insurances, and they're critical to make sure that those parameters are well set in a way that also is sustainable, is viable. And we've seen actually also in Haiti examples of micro-insurance, for farmers that unfortunately have not been able to be sustained and to work because they did not rely on the right data for their payouts. So this is interesting because this is in the Caribbean. This is the CRIF. I'm sure some of you know, is the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facilities that has been supported by the bank and the EU. And it's a way, essentially, small island states in the Caribbean are pooling their risk. And as this model has been successful and has been recently essentially replicated in the Pacific with the PCRAFI initiative in the Pacific Islands. So now let's come more. Let's zoom in on the Hydromet challenge. In the bank, Hydromet is hydrometeorological services. We use the Hydromet word a lot, but it's hydrometeorological services. Is something that has stemmed from disaster response, essentially, just like in many other development agencies. Typically flood recovery projects in the 90s, lots of infrastructure rebuilding that started to integrate this element. And just to give you, it's a really global program that we have, lots of interventions, and not only in small islands, as you can see. But one very, very critical dimension that, especially for our interlocutors in the country, which are ministries of finance, and this really joins what John was saying before me, one particular element is the the estimation of the socioeconomic benefits of this type of information, this type of data. Why do we bother, essentially? And it's unbelievable how this type of assessments speaks volume much more than unfortunately even the events themselves to the ministers of finance. In other words, estimating what is the return of investment on meteorological services, on early warning system. These are something that today we can do in a more and more precise way. I also want to thank USAID for the support that they've been providing to the bank for this global methodology that on assessment of cost benefit for climate, hydrometeorological and climate services, which will be presented at the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization conference in May, which is a big benchmark for this type of assessment. But in any, the key message really is that to get the ministers of finance on board, these are the type of argument that we need, that we are using in the countries. So interestingly, the World Bank has recently completed an evaluation of almost 30 years of projects in hydromet. It's something that, as you can see, is not started recently, but started a while ago. And really, one issue, something that we have observed is that from a very piecemeal approach, you know, as I was saying, flood response projects or infrastructure project that wanting to include an hydrometeorological component, more and more we have developed a holistic approach. So really looking at different sectors that can benefit from this information and that can be users, end users for this information. And these are the sort of the three key aspects that should be included in any successful hydromet modernization program. Number one, institutional strengthening, which is interestingly something that is being demanded more and more, not only from small islands and low-income countries, but also from middle-income countries. I was 10 days ago in Colombia attending a conference with organized by WMO with the directors of hydrometeorological agencies of all the Latin American countries. So we're talking about countries like Brazil, Argentina, Colombia. And I was amazed by their demand for assistance to do this, to really look at global benchmarks for successful hydromet agencies and help them develop plan to integrate more and more science into their way of functioning. Many of these agencies, for example, come from a military, evolve from military to civilian agencies, so typically under aviation, for example, and they need to have more, better strategies to evolve, to integrate science, and so on. Secondly, the observation infrastructure and forecasting, upgrading it, of course, and then thirdly, the service delivery, so working with end users. And what are the main reasons of failure of this type of projects? Again, from this evaluation. So lack of understanding from the key decision making in government, so ministers of finance and the likes, and lack of commitment, lack of long-term sustainability and thinking on how to ensure this sustainability. 10 to 15% is the budget for operation and maintenance that is very often, unfortunately, overlooked when we do this type of projects, and is really critical to sustain the results after the end of the projects. Lack of coordination and technical complexities, and in particular, the last two are for small island states are critical. I'll go very quickly to this report. Interestingly, I can sympathize with John's comment about looking for reports. This is also on the World Bank website, but it's also much easier to find on Google, and that must mean something, I guess. And basically, it's really the results of this evaluation I was talking about, and also sort of a best practices in weather and climate resilience. Is a very hands-on type of guidance, and these are the key messages. Just to emphasize a couple of points, maybe the operation and maintenance commitment that I mentioned, user interface, data, hydro and meteo data by themselves make no sense, are of no use. Their value is defined by the users, so really they need to be brought on board since the get-go to design this type of information systems, the frequency, the format, etc. Open data, that's another of our key priorities. It's difficult sometimes because some of these agencies, they have been developed with the data for sale business model, and it's not easy to have them change this paradigm, and they require lots of work. So I know that we don't have much time, but when Roger Marks said, okay, the common denominator of the theme of the presentation is the small islands, I try to think of a little bit what are the common denominators of, from a very practitioner's perspective of, the work we do. And here are some of the themes. And then initially I was, thinking, okay, the negative things, the challenges, but then I realized that some of this stuff is also really, there are opportunities, regional and sub-regional level. These are what I was talking earlier about. The bunch of relatively small countries that are pooling and sharing risk. That is an opportunity. Not to talk about data, regional forecasting. What CIMH, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, is doing in Barbados today, and the service that they're providing to these islands. Technical capacity. This is maybe more of a challenge. The migrations, a challenge, but also an opportunity. Just let's think of the diaspora, the Haitian diaspora, and the opportunity to bring back some of these some of these people back to Haiti or in other islands to contribute to the development of their countries. The public budgets, very small budgets, and lots of competing priorities, difficult to really bring this on the top of the agenda. Climate sensitive economies. Unfortunately, the key sectors, the sector that lead the growth of these countries are tourism and agriculture, which are also the most climate sensitive ones. And fragmented financing mechanism is a point that I think has been touched upon by the speakers before me. Really, really challenging for small governments with limited personnel, staff, to deal with several different funds, which each of them carries different modalities for accessing the funds, for implementing the funds. This is a huge challenge that we are witnessing. Okay, let me go. Okay, there is something I wanted to talk about is the GFDRR, this acronym that probably you've seen in the slides. It's the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. It's a program that brings together the bank, some UN agencies, and I think more than 30 donors. And they have developed, they're hosted here in Washington at the World Bank headquarters, but they really focus on technical assistance and on looking at the best practices worldwide on disaster risk management. And they have developed a program on Hydromet. You can find most of these on the internet. This is the URL. But they're really helpful. They're being very helpful in connecting us, first of all, with the WMO, which is the agency, the UN agency, stands for World Meteorological Organization, and it's the UN agency that deals with meteorology and hydrology. And we're really partnering with them in many of these countries. We go in together, and they bring the technical expertise, and we bring the work, the implementation support that we have to these countries. I don't know if I still have another couple of minutes.
Sure.
Yeah, as the last speaker, I get 2 more minutes. Just a quick look at Haiti, which of course is the country very dear to my heart. So interestingly, while we prepare this project on strengthening hydromet services in Haiti, which hopefully should be effective in a couple of months, a 5-year project, we were trying to get an understanding of where all the stations, talking about precipitation measuring stations and hydrological stations are today in Haiti. And although it sounds like an easy task, but it's been in a way also a metaphor of the coordination and the lack of information sharing that today, unfortunately, we're facing in Haiti. And I must say, sometimes us donors are also part of the problem. So this is what we could find, but there is many more stations, and that we could not locate. And this is interestingly the institutional analysis that we did. And for the first level here is basically the data collecting. All those agencies, all the agencies, state and non-state. You see also many NGOs involved in data collection, data management. Added value, so basically turning the data into information, and then the end users. And unfortunately, as you see lots of duplication and lots of money essentially that is wasted, because each of these actors have different operating procedures, have different systems, they pay fees to store the data, etc. And also lots of opportunities that are missed there. So that's something that our project is trying to address. I'm not going to go into details, but essentially, really, after 2 decades probably of projects that have been targeting in Haiti hydromet services, there's been lots of focus on expanding this network, buying more and more stations, but without any consideration to the sustainability aspects, all those issues that I've tried to highlight. The coordination, the data sharing, having common protocols, having a common platform. So, and interestingly today, even when we go in meetings with the different, ministries, environment, agriculture, the first request we get is, we want more station, we need more station. But then when you show them this type of maps, and when you show them this, it's interesting because the attitude starts to change. And especially when you show them how much it costs and for them annually to maintain the stations, and how much they have right now in the budget, which is 0. So these are really good arguments to change this paradigm and really to help them think more in a long-term perspective. So unfortunately, I don't have time to go into details, but if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaetano. So, I think when we look at islands and data, there's very often the question about downscaling, which is a real problem. I think you addressed that. Interesting to hear about the sharing and pooling of risks within the Caribbean, and then, of course, the problem of donor coordination and partnership. I think your example with GFDRR is very interesting, sort of that hub and that network coming out of Washington, D.C. I think many of us who were following what was happening in Haiti over the past few years were very much struck by the overabundance of actors in Haiti. You talk about the military coming in, there's a humanitarian, there's a development community, there are the donors. From the bank's perspective, and you identify this as one of the key problems and challenges, donor and partner coordination. What have you learned in terms of how you are improving how you work with others? You thanked USAID, you talked about working with UN agencies, you mentioned IDB. What are some of the lessons that you have learned in terms of improving donor coordination? It seems sometimes that a country like Haiti is just oversaturated with actors.
Yeah. Well, it would take a while to answer really thoroughly to your question, but the first thing that comes to my mind, took a minute. The first thing that comes to my mind is really, it takes time, first of all, and not all the actors that I see today in Haiti are ready to make this effort of, consulting, engaging with the government. It's easy to blame, the ministry, X or Y, for not having the right staff, not having the right persons, not having the right capacity. But in truth, actually, it takes time, and it takes lots of effort. Like that diagram, the institutional analysis, that took essentially 3 weeks of day-to-day meetings and to get the information. Not to talk about the financial assessment, how much it costs, the economic assessment of the hydromet services. It takes time. It takes long-term commitment. The problem is that in Haiti we have a lot of actors that are there for the short time span. It's a country that historically has been dominated by humanitarian assistance, and nothing wrong with that, but with very little linkages with us, long-term actors. Things have changed a little bit after the earthquake, but still a lot of work to do to really bridge these two communities and these two approaches, because that is, to me, is one of the key problems that we have.
Yeah, so the time factor is really critical. Okay, good, thank you. We're going to open it up shortly to questions. I wanted to add a perspective on some of the work that USAID has been supporting in some of these very locations, and bring in the community side of this question. John talked about the importance of people and people responding to stresses and system-wide responses. Chano talked about opportunities, and Maxine talked about people's responses and storytelling. One of the things that we have seen, and this has been covered by the other speakers, just looking at small island ecosystems and the way that they're linked means that when something happens, there's a ripple effect that happens a lot more closely because of that. And population dynamics and the vulnerability of island peoples is a particular concern. And most recently, just last week, we at the Wilson Center were in Jamaica working with these focal points in the ministry who are rolling out Jamaica's national climate change strategy. And it was very interesting. We were working with them on vulnerability analysis and thinking of how to climate-proof policies and programs. And as we were having these discussions, I would say it was the first time in my doing this work with folks who are rolling out national strategies where women were not identified as a vulnerable group. When I do this work in Africa and other island ecosystems, women always come up. And with this group in Jamaica, it didn't. And USAID, in its climate resilience strategy, has really put at the center women's empowerment as being central to resiliency and developing resiliency to these types of responses. USAID has been supporting this work through investing in family planning, reproductive health, as a way to increase empowerment for women through increasing their social role, economic agency, and health, which leads to better efficacy in terms of livelihood, mobility decisions, economic and educational attainment, environmental stewardship, and community participation, which helps build resilience. And I was quite struck in our discussions today because when you look at small island states and you look at women's empowerment and family size and fertility, there's a real opportunity to think about how do we invest in the social dimensions of climate change adaptation in a development context. And what very often happens is when you take this to the community level, communities very often say that we don't live our lives in silos, that we need an integrated response. And the donors are more and more looking at community-based responses by investing in these social dimensions. One of the most exciting ways that this is being done is through an integrated approach called population, health, and environment. And the pictures that you have here is an integrated program that brings these elements together in Iloilo in the Philippines. And actually, what we see here is community members from Iloilo and Guimaras, which is just a small island across from Iloilo, going into a family planning clinic and asking for services. They go into their services and get these services, but the second step is community mapping on vulnerabilities that's tied to looking at natural vulnerabilities and how the population is settled and household settlement, and that ends with mangrove reforestation. So they go in for health services and they end up replanting mangroves. And this is a very exciting initiative that's linked, that's community driven. And some of the ways that they measure success is they go into the community and they find out how communities think about these issues. So the husband comes home and he tells his wife, tonight's the night. And she says, no, we have to think of the mangrove and the impact that from climate change. Not exactly, but these are the kinds of indicators they're trying to get to because they're hearing from the communities that this is really important to them. And in a country like the Philippines, that it is very decentralized, at the level of the municipality, there are decisions made in terms of budget allocations that are being pushed by the community that is developing resilience at the community level. And this is particularly particularly salient in island communities. So in Iloilo, they found that the contraceptive prevalence rate went up as a result of these interventions, and that there was increased environmental protection. So we know that these types of community interventions are also helping to build resilience. Madagascar is another one of these countries that is one of these island pioneers. Madagascar was one of the first countries that was implementing this integrated population health and environment approach, which started in the early 1990s as integrated conservation and development projects, and going on to today. And many of these programs are recognizing the specific needs of island women in countries like Madagascar. One of the most successful programs is being run by an organization that started as a diving outfit, focusing on, it's called Blue Ventures, and looking at questions around coastal resource management, alternative livelihoods, and developing community resilience in the face of climate change impacts. So integrating this approach on population health and environment. It's also happening in the Caribbean. This is being supported by UNDP through a small grants program administered by the GEF. And what they have done, they have looked at islands from lessons learned from the Pacific Islands, and are using that to apply this throughout the Caribbean in a series of community-based adaptation programs throughout the islands. And this is a lot of what we see in the integrated PhD programming. This is some work that's being done on participatory mapping in Tobago. It's looking at vulnerability assessments, quantitative and capacity analysis, and looking at how you bring in population dynamics and gender mainstreaming. And it's being used as a response mechanism at the community level. So we hear the legal framework, we hear some of the work that's happening at USAID with the government, we hear what's happening in terms of disaster mitigation and planning and coordination, but there's also a lot happening at the community level that we need to recognize that there are really good opportunities for application across small island developing states. And this is part of what we were trying to get in this framing of pioneers and champions of resilience. So this is the work that we were doing just last week with the folks in Jamaica that John was working with. And this is we working with these focal points in the ministries, but having them think about how gender and population dynamics fit in. So it was very exciting to have someone who's working on infrastructure and a road network development, and what does it mean in terms of a logistic hub in response to dynamics around the Panama Canal, and how Jamaica is going to respond to this, say, wow, we have to be thinking about women and how many children they would like to have, and this actually is an important component of thinking of climate change adaptation strategies. It really is more of this holistic approach that we see coming in at the community level. So this is work that this community has done in the Philippines, this is in Indonesia, in Madagascar, and in the Caribbean. So just to say there's a community perspective and dimension to this work that's also happening in an island context, and it's a very added, a very important additional dimension to this work. So I just wanted to share that perspective also, because that is very is happening right now, and it's very active and engaging. So I want to open it up to get some thoughts and questions and reactions, and we'll take all the questions at once and try to get to as many of them as we can. So please, if you can give your name and your affiliation.
Hi, Kelly Witkowski with the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. You know, listening to your presentations and in my own work on climate change adaptation in the ag sector, it seems that there's a line drawn between obviously the disaster risk communities and the climate change adaptation communities and the different international frameworks, but on the ground, obviously that's not as distinct. And I was wondering if you can just speak a little bit about that in your experiences, and how to communicate that clearly to stakeholders, that a lot of what is disaster risk management, climate change adaptation, it's the same measures and just with a different name. So I was just wondering if you can please speak about your experiences.
And when you say stakeholders, who are you thinking development
I think it's-
practitioners?
No, I'm thinking more of like farmers, for example.
Okay, got it.
or, and development practitioners as well that maybe are not working in this
Yeah.
space.
Got it.
Like I don't know, extension officers
Mhm.
or that don't. This is not their focus of their work.
Right. Great. Good. Yes. Other questions? Yes, please.
Myron Beckenstein, University of Maryland. Since Vanuatu is such an endangered place, and since there's a focus on it now and money pouring in because of the weather emergency, would it be better to use the money to help people relocate to another area rather than just rebuilding buildings that are likely to be destroyed by the next one?
That's like a question for you, Maxine. Okay. Other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, Ethan Goffman from Sustainability Science Practice and Policy. Basically, climate change is an international issue, but we've basically got a nation-state system that each nation-state looks out for its own interests above all. And I'm just wondering if you feel like there would be specific international institutions that could help you. Like, for instance, there's a proposal for a World Environmental Organization. So what would you really need to make your efforts at integration more effective? What kind of institutional changes would you like to see globally?
Great, thank you. So looking at distinct divisions on the ground related to disaster mitigation and other sectors, relocation as a strategy, and what changes could we see in terms of international institutions. Gaetano, would you like to start?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first one.
Sure.
On the divisions between the disaster risk management and the climate change communities, which indeed is an issue. It's an issue that we are witnessing on the ground as well in these countries. Although, I mean, of course, there have been and there are more and more efforts to harmonize tools, languages, between these two communities. I think the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery has really taken this as one of their priorities. And it's even just an issue like language, like terminology it makes a difference when you really look at harmonizing funding mechanisms and project design. So work is being done. It remains a challenge, and particularly in fragile states or low-income countries with the situation of fragility like Haiti, the climate change dimension of the problem is something that is much more recent, understood to a certain degree, I would say, because it's now starting. I think it's especially over the past couple of years. One big problem is also that for Haiti, compared to other parts of the world, we don't have much information in terms of long-term climate models because of the, again, lack of data, lack of historical data sets. So the information is a little bit patchy, and the predictions on long-term trends of climate is a little bit less reliable. So Haiti, given all the history of shocks, not only hydrometeorological and climate shocks, but also other from other levels, has been the time span has always been very short term. So it's always been a country more focused on disaster response, and already now looking at the disaster risk reduction part of the issue is being a challenge, let alone having a long-term view. In the point, in my opinion, is really to look at the common gains that we have, which are definitely those that will make a difference to the life of a farmer or even someone in the government. We don't not necessarily farmer, even educated people. The important thing is to show to work on these synergies and on these opportunities that we have of merging these two agendas with all related funding and science and tools that each of the two brings.
John?
So I'll also comment on the first one and leave the later ones for Maxine. I think to a farmer, they experience what they experience. You don't experience a trend, you experience the pieces that add up to the trend. We find that one of the ways to engage them is to talk about what they have experienced. If you ask a lot of people in the first U.S. national assessment in the 15, 20 years ago, I think in the Mid-Atlantic assessment, they talked to different stakeholder groups about had they experienced climate change, and the answer was generally no. Well, you experienced an unexpected flood? Yes. Unexpected drought? Yes. Unexpected late frost, early frost, whatever. Yeah. Okay, so you put it in terminology that the stakeholders you're working with can understand. Don't expect a farmer in Jamaica or Grenada or anywhere else to become a climate expert. Let them stick to farming as best they can, and let the other people involved discern the information that you need from them and then deliver it back in a form that they can use. Because if you go in talking to them about probabilities above average and below normal and blah, 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 they're not going to understand the help that you're providing either. So there's got to be this translation function. Part of that is they don't care. I mean, if a farmer, the people in Vanuatu, if it's determined that had nothing to do with human-induced climate change, that's not going to make them feel any better. So putting it in terms that people can understand and work with, and that allow you to get information back so you can work with them, is what's important. And then also to the point about the GFDRR, and then in one of the slides was the Global Framework for Climate Services. Yeah. These two efforts are working together. And then in our analysis framework, when we start talking to people about stresses and constraints that they experience, we had a great exchange in St. Lucia where somebody said, we build on the beach, we have a storm, everything gets knocked down, and we go back and do it again. So before they start thinking about long-term improvements, they just wanted to get the zoning code enforced. So they stopped putting stuff in harm's way. And so I think, again, on the ground, it's not that important to people, this distinction between weather and climate, or short-term and long-term. It's what's impacting what they're trying to do.
Hey, so this actually, the question about Vanuatu and how to approach it in terms of decision-making moving forward is somewhat related. It doesn't necessarily matter what the trigger is, although perhaps with the funding source you're looking for and those sorts of things it matters, but the coordination issues would be relevant here. The short answer to the question of whether or not to rebuild or to plan for moving is yes, both. Right? In some ways, what we're looking at is an opportunity to rebuild and build better in light of what we know about the increasing rate of climate change and the changes that are happening, but also recognizing that relocating, while it's being sort of embraced more as a viable adaptation option, sort of in a policy format, involves a lot of unanswered questions that are still up for some pretty heated, controversial conversation. But the short answer in the abstract is that both would be needed, because even if we can imagine a very seamless transition to another community, in the meantime, there's still their lives to be lived in those communities, their children to be raised in the culture, their relationships to maintain, their skills to build, to anticipate that possible migration. And that's the kind of work that we're seeing being done in places like Kiribati, where there are policy approaches that are referred to as migration with dignity, where they're anticipating the need to migrate. They see this as a 1 to maybe 2 generation long process, and what they're working on is trying to find a way to build skills amongst their community members to allow for their migration to occur in a way that respects themselves, and allows them to bring skills to their new host communities, that will ease transition so that they're not second-class citizens, which often happens with people that are forced to move for whatever reason they might be forced to move. The issue of migration that becomes sticky because you're forced to ask, where are most communities going to go? Who will pay for that? How do we support host communities? What do we do about the inevitable sort of loss of cultural heritage and the tensions and the sadnesses that come with having to leave your territory, leave your place of birth. Especially in the Pacific, there is a sense that relocation should be discussed with a lot of care, because while it might make sense as a planning matter, it is still a major decision and a major severing of relationships to move from one place to another. Most of the time, you're also moving to disparate places. The Marshall Islands is a perfect example. We have a number of Marshallese in Honolulu. This is a migration sort of corridor that's been over time, over generations. There's also a community in Arkansas. There are a number of places where they sort of end up based on economy. And so there is a real importance in having the conversation about migration, cognizant of some of the sort of technical difficulties, the funding difficulties, and what it requires of Pacific peoples who, in particular, have a relationship to land, to ancestors that's quite strong, and for which separation really represents a major non-economic loss for them as well.
Maybe if I can add very briefly on this very important point on relocation. One of the challenges is often also the land titling issues, and in general the legal aspects. This is something that I witnessed in working in Haiti on relocation, not under the framework, the climate change framework, but as a consequence of the earthquake. Most of the people that are affected by disasters or that are vulnerable to climate change are the poorest and people who are extremely insecure in terms of land tenure. And it's extremely complex to even design one of these programs for how to compensate them, what are the guidelines, what are the criteria, the eligibility. It's extremely complex. So and today, unfortunately, most of this work has only been done under the humanitarian, exclusively under the humanitarian lens. There is really and unfortunately, because this is something that in Haiti came out a lot, like talking with them. Humanitarians don't have solutions. We don't have solutions. There are solutions that are, kind of in that gray zone that we are, in the case of Haiti, we developed with this cash grants, for example, some innovative methodologies to compensate or to relocate these affected persons. But in reality, these toolboxes are empty. And we need really concrete tools and responses to start before we start envisaging this type of things. It's a very complex area which really requires a joint collaboration between humanitarians and long-term development actors.
That's right.
And any thoughts on the international institutions?
If I understood the question correctly, I think, or at least what I took away from the question was that there's a fascinating collision of concerns here with climate change, in that we manage it at this international level and we experience it and try to adapt to it at a very, very, very local level, at sort of the family and household level. And how do you coordinate between those many scales? And that vertical coordination is a really key part of thinking about the issues of policy management and funding, and making sure that disbursement of funds actually go to the places that need it. I see this as oftentimes a community-based adaptation, the grassroots efforts, trying to communicate effectively with the grass tops, and it's of course the entire blade, if you will. And one of the things that we think about in looking at migration, which it's true is a massive issue. What we don't want to see happen is for the sort of scope, the incredible scope of the issues, to mean that no one handles the core crises because it's so controversial. It's an easy to sort of hot potato in that way. So how do we do that better in terms of coordination? I think that's a question that remains to be answered. I think when we're thinking about the Green Climate Fund as one particular example, that we continue to look at coordination and funding and at that sort of institutional level, international level, but how we continue to keep lines of communication and funding down to the community-based level will animate the discussion. And I think it is on some level, but maintaining that will be key.
Okay, any last burning? We'll take a couple questions.
Yeah, Jack Stern, Prosperity of the Commons International. Roger Mark, I was really interested in this linkage between, family health services, women's health services, and mangrove restoration. We're in the very early stages of a project. It's about rebuilding Caribbean coastal livelihoods in both Jamaica and Grenada. And, we're trying to do coral reef restoration on a coast-wide scale as sort of the anchor of that project that would also deal with wastewater treatment, fisheries, solid waste management. We got the fire at the Riverton plant in Kingston, and there's tremendous opportunities there around waste energy, and there are all these integrated things. But you brought up a point that I hadn't even thought of before, because one of the things we're going to have to do is create this labor force to do this coastal reef restoration and ultimately mangrove plantings. And I'm just curious how those linkages happen and how you get from one thing to the other.
I'm Sally Kane. I'm with the University of New South Wales in Sydney, as well as a Society for Risk Analysis. So what a great event. Really, really fascinating, just really cutting edge. If you've watched the adaptation area evolve from the academic perspective and government perspective, and now in terms of practice, everything has moved ahead so quickly. It's wonderful. So I have just a couple of quick maybe questions or comments. One is for Roger Mark. Really interesting in terms of the use of the clinics for family planning. I've been doing some work with people in New South Wales about Ebola. And so trying to get the word out, trying to have people become more comfortable with change of traditions, burial practices. How do you learn from community to community? What I'm trying to say is there's a emphasis from the central government about what they'd like to do to try and reduce the losses from Ebola, reduce the number of people that are exposed, improve the practices. Now some of the countries are trying to use some of these health systems. I'm just wondering if you've moved in that area yourself. That's part of what you do. Professor, I pronounce your last name right, sorry.
Maxine's fine.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I've actually been a YAP for Sea Level Rise project a number of years ago, and what's really interesting in Micronesia, in that part of the world, at YAP, is that you've got these interlocking systems of property rights. So maybe a perception of risk from flooding, from sea level rise, from storms, but there's a sense that this high island is off limits in terms of migration because of who holds the property rights. So I think in terms of governance, you have to be really creative, it seems to me, in terms of trying to use the building blocks that you all are putting in place and encouraging this flexibility over time and trying to learn about the key issues and how they can be addressed. Some of the USAID work is so interesting in terms of how it's meshed with NOAA's work in this area. And I'm just wondering if you've have worked with people or know about the RISA program, the Regional Integrated Science Assessment. The reason I mention that is because academics and NGOs are brought in, and so you can take the stresses, the physical stresses, climate, other environmental stresses that these areas have. And the solutions are seen as building the information systems over time, but also the flexibility. And so that's kind of also in terms of the World Bank. I guess I'm a social scientist and so economist. And so what I see is kind of the glue through a lot of this is people's perception.
Yeah.
How are they going to change? How can you encourage what we learn in the universities to be more, to come into these discussions and then somehow work its way down. So,
Great.
a long comment. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So let's get sort of final comments and response. So anyone would like to start?
Sure, I can start. And specifically thinking about the issues of migration, and this is, again, something I could talk about for days and days, and thankfully we only have a minute. But I absolutely right. There are these complicated systems of property rights that can be that are sort of non-starters in terms of the conversation at this point, that need to be coordinated, that are incredible obstacles to moving people without a fair amount of coordination and community engagement in the process. There are also different cultural ways of managing land, so we understand land and property rights in a very Western context, but of course there are clan affiliations, there are different ways of organizing who makes decisions about the property that they have, there are gender dynamics that are involved. This is incredibly complicated. So when I think about property rights and land title, it's within the entire basket of concerns that we need to be thinking about that are incredibly entangled. So what is it? Property rights? Is it the safety and security in the community that you might be moving to? This has limited some decisions about where to consider migrating to because of civil conflict, various rights that citizens might have, the absence of any real sense of resettlement rights based on these conditions. There are issues of how to support the host communities, what happens to people that leave communities that whose territory has been completely destroyed or is no longer habitable. There are issues of management of EEZs and baselines and setting baselines. It is enormous, the amount of things that come into play when we're thinking about migration. And I mention that not to discourage us from dealing with it. In fact, it means that we should be dealing with it now, if not several years ago, especially because it was identified in 1990 as one of the major impacts of climate change would be human migration. I mention it mostly to say that we are, the sort of lethargy, the inertia, the absence of thinking about this deeply is because we're still bound up in the, is it happening? Why is it happening? Is it climate? Important questions, definitely, but whether or not that should limit us from moving rapidly to starting to think about these things, because it's going to take a while for us to get there, and then to sort of find a way to negotiate between two discrete spaces about how people will move, right? So we have to have these conversations at that level. So I absolutely endorse the sentiment behind this, which is that we have to think about these issues of property rights, but that's also part of these other issues that involve humanitarian law, migration, immigration at domestic level, environmental law, national security,
So I'll make a quick comment on the clinics and labor first. I don't know anything about that, but I do know that AID has been using as part of an aspect of our humanitarian assistance programs is food for work programs. And then something that's interesting that we're experimenting with, I believe in Senegal, is a work for premiums program. So we're introducing index insurance for smallholder farmers, and a lot of them can't afford the premium or aren't fully convinced that they want it. So it's a comprehensive program of risk reduction, introduction of banking and savings, and in the insurance product. So they can work on the risk reducing practices in order to effectively earn the premium, and they don't have to pay it themselves, but then they're covered by the index insurance. On the RISA program, yes, I think that's a really cool program. There was a picture of Roger Polwardy in one of Roger Mark's slides, and he was one of the early leaders of the RISA program. I used to be at EPA, and my office at EPA and NOAA worked closely together. So I'm familiar with it. We also work with NOAA in the field. I work very closely with the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, which is a group at Columbia University that NOAA kind of created. And so they're our partner in a lot of our climate service work. AID and the National Science Foundation have a program called PEER that enables NSF-funded US researchers to partner with developing country researchers on projects primarily in the developing world. And then we've had other programs aimed at trying to bring together the research and sort of action communities. And then just my my mental model for how to do all this stuff grew out of my work on the first U.S. national assessment, which was strongly influenced by the RISA model.
Yeah, maybe just a quick comment on your remark on the balance between science and society and community knowledge. This is it made me think of a story, an anecdote that I find that I was told while doing those interviews with I think it was the Ministry of Agriculture. So essentially, I don't remember which agency was setting up these automatic rain gauges in rural Haiti, and they happened to do so in a community, very remote community in the southwest part of Haiti. Unfortunately, the installation of the rain gauge coincided with the period of drought. It was a month or two without rain, and the reaction of the community was to destroy the machine, because by some people it was considered as the cause of that period of drought. What the anecdote really showed me is that it's really critical to find this balance between the science and the community, between the data, which are critical because today we need to inform the plans, the policies with evidence. That's a no-brainer, but also to find the balance with the behavioral part of this discipline. And to me, this is the most fascinating and also the least known part. So actually maybe we should discuss and see how we can also have more of this type of thinking in organizations like the World Bank and others, because that's where I really see the challenge of the hydromet and climate science today. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So a very quick response to the questions on the side of the health dimension. I think a lot of groups, conservation groups, and groups working on disaster mitigation and on climate change resilience have gone into these communities and have tried to put in place these projects and programs. And the communities have said, we need to deal with our health concerns first. So if you want us to do these things, address our priority needs first, and then we can work with you. So very often it has been a process that's driven by the communities, and the groups who want to do that work have seen that it is a way to develop trust with those communities to help them achieve the other programmatic objectives like mangrove reforestation. So it has been a way to develop that relationship with the community and to implement these programs jointly with the communities. And it has allowed, particularly in Iloilo, that program is still going on, even though the external donors are no longer funding it. So once you get that community buy-in, it has really provided opportunities for long-term sustainability. We've had examples in Madagascar. Blue Ventures have spoken about, because they have developed that trust with the community, when a disaster occurs, they were the ones who were able to be the first responders because of that trust. So as opposed to a humanitarian group coming in, they have been able to respond first and meet the most critical needs. It has also involved some regulation at the local level, at that decentralized level, wardens who are looking at no-take areas, etc. So some regulation has come into play too. On the public health questions, it depends specifically on the local context. In a country like the Philippines, that is predominantly Roman Catholic, 95% Roman Catholic, you come in and you talk about issues like family planning, reproductive health, that you're tying to climate change vulnerabilities. At times there is resistance. So at times that's coming in through ministries of health who are looking more of a broader public health intervention and roll in reproductive health, family planning, women's empowerment as part of that programming. In other settings, there have been joint programming with agricultural extension workers and public health extension workers that then go together to communities to provide joint training and counseling and skills development. So it's happening in a broader public health framework, but not necessarily so much around disease and disease transmission. So What a great discussion. I agree, cutting edge. Thank you. Thank you to Gaetano, John, and Maxine. And to let you know, we have recorded this event, so go to the Woodrow Wilson Center's website, wilsoncenter.org. You will see it there. We will write a blog summary of the discussions, which you can access on our blog site, newsecuritybeat.org. And all of the PowerPoint presentations will also be there and available for you, so you can have a look at them, download them, and come back to us with more questions and feedback. But thank you. This was a fantastic discussion.
Thank you.
I'm sure you have lots of questions. Okay, let me just say thank you. I'll be right there.